The 1990s Moscow turf wars weren't a crime wave. They were a hostile takeover of reality. What happens when a nuclear superpower collapses? And the empty space gets filled not by law, but by men with gym-built bodies, cheap suits, and pistol-grip certainty. Who really controlled Moscow when aluminum and oil became more valuable than human life? And why did the city learn to flinch at elevator doors? Welcome to the wild 90s, where money was born screaming, and Moscow learned a new language. Fear with paperwork. Chapter 1, The Night the State Went Offline. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapses, and the rules don't just change, they evaporate. A country that once made every citizen feel watched suddenly feels unwatched. Factories, shipping routes, rail depots, fuel, metals, ports, banks, and private security firms all become prizes. Not symbolic prizes, cash machines. And when the legal system can't decide who owns what, ownership is settled the old way. Who can put men at the gate faster? Who can intimidate a director? Who can protect a business from the protection racket next door? The European Parliament later summarized how criminal syndicates asserted themselves through the Moscow turf wars of the 1990s, including violent competition and growing influence over trade, but in real time it didn't feel like organized crime. It felt like the city was being divided into invisible borders, one street at a time. Chapter 2, Moscow's New Map, Borders You Couldn't See. The gangs weren't mythological. They were structured. Names like Solntsevskaya and Orekhovskaya appear again and again in accounts of post-Soviet organized crime and scholarship discussing violent gang warfare in Moscow in the early 1990s. In the city, people learned to read the atmosphere, which cafes were owned, which nightclubs weren't safe to look confident in, which markets required a fee that wasn't written down, which streets turned quiet when the wrong car rolled through. And then came the phenomenon that terrified everyone who wasn't carrying a weapon. The professionalization of violence, not chaos, not riots, contract killings, ambushes, explosions. The Guardian describes the notorious aluminium wars of the early 1990s as a period of thugs occupying factories and a string of murders tied to business disputes. Chapter 3, Aluminum, Oil, and a Bullets Economy. Aluminum doesn't sound sexy. It's not gold. It's not diamonds. But in the 1990s, it was a miracle commodity. Light, exportable in demand, and perfect for a state that was suddenly broke. Control an aluminum plant, and you controlled raw output, export contracts, shipping, profit streams in hard currency, which meant aluminum wasn't a metal. It was a war zone disguised as industry. And the violence wasn't random. It followed incentives. If you controlled the director, you controlled the signatures. If you controlled the signatures, you controlled ownership. If you controlled ownership, you controlled cash flow. And if someone else controlled it yesterday, then yesterday became negotiable. A Moscow Times report from 2015 describes a gangster jailed for contract killings tied to the 1990s aluminum wars, underscoring how those disputes translated into murder-for-hire cases. If you're getting that tight feeling in your chest right now, that's the correct response. And if you want more investigations that map how power actually behaves when society fractures, drop a like and subscribe to Behind the Veil Truths. We go where the polite summaries won't. Chapter 4, The Chechen Factor and the City's Fear Calculus. Moscow's criminal landscape wasn't one uniform block. Different groups competed, allied, fractured, and fought. Analysts and institutional reports note the influence of Chechen syndicates and violent turf conflicts in Moscow during the 1990s. To everyday Muscovites, it didn't matter which faction's name was whispered. What mattered was the pattern. A new group takes territory. Businesses switch protection overnight. Someone refuses. Someone disappears. A manager signs a new document. The city pretends it didn't notice. And then, as if the city itself had developed a nervous system, Moscow learned to anticipate escalation before it happened. People started saying things like, "Don't stand near the entrance. Don't get into arguments in public. Don't look like you're watching." Because sometimes the most dangerous act in a turf war was simply being a witness. Chapter 5, When Business Meant a Funeral Schedule. Here's the twist that outsiders often miss. These weren't just gang wars. They were business wars. The men doing the killing weren't always street criminals. They were frequently hired labor in a larger machine. The murky collision of privatization, corrupted enforcement, and organized protection rackets. As The Guardian notes, murder became a common method for resolving business disputes in that era. That sentence is a polite way of saying, in 1990s Moscow, contracts were enforced with violence, so the city adjusted. Businessmen traveled with armed guards. Apartment lobbies became checkpoints. The line between state security and private muscle blurred. Random explosions stopped feeling random. And every time a new fortune appeared, people asked the same quiet question. How many deaths paid for that? Chapter 6. The moment it stopped, and why that's the most suspicious part. By the late 1990s into the 2000s, the bloodshed didn't vanish so much as consolidate. The chaos of many competing actors slowly hardened into fewer, more stable power structures. Analysts of Russian organized crime describe how groups evolved after the early post-Soviet free-for-all, and this is where the story takes its darkest turn. When turf wars calm down, it doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means someone won, and winners don't like witnesses. Final stinger, the files that never open. The 1990s Moscow turf wars left behind more than bodies. They left behind missing records, rewritten ownership papers, accidents that never made sense, and people who survived by learning to forget convincingly. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Do you think the truth of the Moscow turf wars is still unsolved? Or is it known, just not speakable? And if you were there, in that city at that time, would you have recognized the moment Moscow stopped being governed by law and started being governed by fear? Drop your theory in the comments. What do you think really ended the violence, consolidation, state pressure, or something darker? And if you want the next episode, where we follow one specific commodity trail from business dispute to street-level executions to the quiet rise of new power, subscribe to Behind the Veil Truths. Because the 1990s didn't end. They just learned how to wear a suit